whispers in the walls. Catherine and Mark stood in the driveway, staring up at the old Victorian house that loomed before them. It was a beautiful relic from another era, with its gabled roof, intricately carved wooden trim, and tall, narrow windows that gave it a stately, if somewhat eerie, appearance. They had fallen in love with it the moment they saw it online, an old, grand house on the outskirts of town, tucked away from the bustle of city life. It was a fresh start, exactly what they needed after the chaos of the last few months. Mark glanced at Catherine with a grin. "Our new home," he said, slinging an arm around her shoulder. "What do you think?" She smiled up at him, the excitement in his voice infectious. "It's perfect," she whispered, almost in awe of their luck. The house was much larger than what they had expected to afford, but it had been listed at a strangely low price. Catherine had questioned it at first. Such a big house, with so much land, seemed too good to be true. But Mark had convinced her that it was a steal, and soon they were signing papers and planning their future in this grand old home. They stood on the porch now, keys in hand, ready to open the door to their new life. "Ready?" Mark asked, giving her a playful nudge. Catherine nodded, her heart fluttering with anticipation. She wasn't sure if it was excitement or nerves that made her stomach twist, but she chalked it up to the thrill of moving into a new place. After all, every old house had its quirks, its own personality, and this one was no different. As they stepped inside, the house greeted them with a soft creak, the wood floors groaning under their weight. The air smelled faintly of dust and aged wood, but it wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it felt warm, cozy, even. The interior was just as grand as the exterior. The entryway led into a large, open living room with a tall, vaulted ceiling and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the light filtering through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the floor. It felt like stepping into another time, another world. Catherine walked through the living room, her fingers brushing the banister of the wide staircase that led to the second floor. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her voice soft with wonder. Mark followed behind her, beaming with pride. "Wait until you see the kitchen," he said, grabbing her hand and leading her through the house. "It's huge." They spent the next few hours exploring every nook and cranny of their new home, opening every door, peeking into every closet. Catherine marveled at the old charm of the place, the antique light fixtures, the ornate crown molding, the faded but beautiful wallpaper that lined the walls. It felt like they had stepped back in time, into a house that had been waiting just for them. By the time they had finished exploring, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the house. They were both exhausted from the day's excitement, but the sense of accomplishment and joy was palpable. They collapsed onto the couch they had just pushed into place in the living room, catching their breath. Mark smiled at her, his eyes twinkling. "Can you believe it?" he asked. "This place is ours." Catherine shook her head, still in disbelief. "I know, it feels like a dream." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the trees outside the window. The house seemed to settle around them, the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner the only sound. Then, something else, a faint noise, caught Catherine's attention. She sat up, frowning slightly. "Did you hear that?" Mark turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Hear what?" She hesitated, listening carefully. There it was again, soft, indistinct, like a low whisper carried on the wind. It was so faint she couldn't make out the words, but it definitely sounded like someone speaking. "It's probably just the house settling," Mark said, noticing her expression. "Old houses like this make all sorts of weird noises." Catherine nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The whispering continued, so faint it was barely audible, and then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination. After all, it was an old house. There were bound to be strange sounds. Over the next few days, they busied themselves unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling into their new home. Catherine tried to push the strange whisper from her mind, but every now and then she would hear it again, soft, indistinct voices, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. She mentioned it to Mark once or twice, but he always shrugged it off, attributing it to the house's old pipes or the wind. One night, about a week after they had moved in, Catherine woke suddenly, her heart racing. At first, she wasn't sure what had startled her, but then she heard it again, that faint whispering. Only this time, it was louder, clearer. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whispers were coming from the walls, deep inside the house, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking. Catherine's skin prickled with unease, and she nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark groaned, half asleep. "What is it?" "The whispering. It's coming from the walls," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark listened for a moment, frowning. Then he shook his head. It's just the house. Go back to sleep. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She lay awake 4 hours, listening as the whispers continued, ebbing and flowing, like the murmur of a distant conversation. The words were just out of reach, but the tone, low, insistent, sent a shiver down her spine. The next morning, Catherine decided to do some investigating. She walked around the house, pressing her ear to the walls, trying to pinpoint where the whispers were coming from. But every time she thought she had found the source, the whispers seemed to shift, moving to another part of the house. It was as if the voices were following her, just beyond her grasp. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that it was just her imagination running wild in the unfamiliar surroundings. But the whispers persisted. They grew louder each night, and soon, Catherine wasn't the only one hearing them. Mark woke up in the middle of the night a few days later, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine nodded, her stomach churning with dread. "Yes," she said softly. "I've been hearing it 4 days." Mark sat up, rubbing his hands over his face. "It's like someone's in the walls," he muttered, "but there's no one here." They lay in bed, listening to the whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once. This time, the voices were clearer. Catherine could almost make out the words, but not quite. They sounded urgent, frantic, as if they were trying to communicate something important, but the message was just out of reach. The next morning, they decided to check the house from top to bottom, looking for any logical explanation. Maybe there were animals in the walls, or perhaps the plumbing was causing the strange noises. But after hours of searching, they found nothing, no signs of rodents, no loose pipes. The house was in perfect condition, yet the whispers persisted. As days turned into weeks, the whispers grew more distinct. At first, it was just the occasional phrase, a word or two that would slip through the murmur. But soon, the voices were speaking in full sentences. They spoke of strange things, events that hadn't happened yet. The whispers seemed to know things about them, about their lives, their future. And one night, as Catherine lay awake in the dark, listening to the voices that now felt like they were closing in on her, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "They will die soon," one of the voices whispered. "They can't escape," another added, its tone almost gleeful. Catherine's heart stopped. She bolted upright in bed, her mind racing. The whispers weren't just random noises or tricks of the imagination. They were real. They were talking about her and Mark, and they knew how it would end. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, the room bathed in the soft, silvery glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Her breath was shallow, and the weight of dread pressed on her, like something unseen was standing over her, watching. The words she had just heard, the whispers predicting their deaths, echoed in her mind, twisting her stomach into tight knots. She turned to look at Mark. He was still asleep, his chest rising and falling steadily. For a moment, she considered waking him, but then she stopped herself. What could she say? That the whispers, the ones they had both heard, were now predicting their deaths? Would he even believe her, or would he try to rationalize it away, the same way he had with everything else that had happened since they moved into the house? Catherine slid out of bed carefully, her feet landing softly on the wooden floor. She needed space to think, to clear her mind from the haunting sounds that seemed to follow her everywhere in the house. She padded silently across the room, trying to keep the floorboards from creaking as she made her way down the hall and into the kitchen. The house was quiet now, eerily so, as though it were holding its breath. She flipped on the light in the kitchen, the soft glow illuminating the room in warm, yellow light. Catherine poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly as she raised it to her lips. As the cool liquid slid down her throat, she felt a slight reprieve from the panic rising inside her, but the reprieve was short-lived. The moment she set the glass down on the counter, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, and they seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath her feet. She felt the weight of their presence pressing down on her, like the house itself was trying to communicate something to her, trying to tell her something vital. The voices overlapped, making it hard to discern what they were saying, but one voice in particular cut through the others, cold and clear. "They are coming." Catherine's pulse quickened, her mind racing. Who was coming? What did the voices mean? She backed away from the counter, her eyes darting around the kitchen, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows, but the room remained empty. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint whispers that seemed to crawl through the walls. She needed to get out of the house. She needed to get Mark and Lee before whatever was coming, whatever the whispers were warning her about, arrived. Catherine hurried back upstairs, her heart pounding as she threw open the bedroom door. "Mark," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." Mark Mark stirred, groaning as he rubbed his eyes. "What's wrong?" he muttered sleepily, clearly not fully awake yet. "We need to go," Catherine said, her voice trembling with urgency. "We need to leave the house." Mark blinked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The whispers," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They are getting louder, and they said," she hesitated, the weight of the words almost too heavy to speak. "They said someone's coming. They said we're going to die." Mark's face paled slightly, but he shook his head, trying to remain calm. "It's just the house, Kath," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We both tired, and this place has been messing with our heads. You're letting it get to you." Catherine's frustration flared. "Mark, I'm not imagining this," she snapped, her voice louder than she intended. "I've heard them every night, and now they are talking about our deaths. This isn't just in my head." Mark sat up, running a hand through his hair. He could see how shaken Catherine was, how deeply the whispers were affecting her. "Okay," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's calm down. I don't hear anything right now, and there's no one here but us. Maybe we should talk to someone, get the house checked out, or even have someone coming to inspect the walls. There's got to be a logical explanation." But Catherine wasn't convinced. "It's not the house settling," she insisted. "These whispers, they are not random noises. They are voices, Mark, real voices, and they know things about us. They know what's going to happen." Mark hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly, his voice softening. "Let's just leave," Catherine said, her voice pleading. "For a night or a weekend. Let's get out of here and see if the whispers follow us. If they stop, then we'll know it's the house. But if they don't," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. If the whispers didn't stop, then it meant something far more terrifying, that whatever was happening wasn't tied to the house, but to them. Mark sighed, looking torn. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said, his tone resigned. "We can leave for a couple of days, clear our heads. Maybe it'll help." Relief washed over Catherine, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe leaving the house, even temporarily, would give them the clarity they needed. They packed hastily, throwing a few essentials into suitcases. Catherine tried to ignore the whispers that had started up again, faint and persistent, as if the house itself was protesting their decision to leave. As they loaded the car, she glanced up at the windows of the house, half expecting to see something watching them from the shadows. But the house remained still, silent, its dark windows staring back at her like vacant eyes. As they pulled out of the driveway and drove down the long, winding road that led away from the property, Catherine felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. The farther they got from the house, the quieter the whispers became, until finally they disappeared altogether. Mark glanced over at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "See," he said softly, "we just needed some space. We'll get to the bottom of this, but for now, let's just focus on taking a break." Catherine nodded, leaning her head back against the seat. Maybe he was right. Maybe the house was playing tricks on them, and all they needed was a little distance. They arrived at a small motel on the edge of town and checked in, eager to leave the strange events of the past few weeks behind them. The room was simple but clean, with 2 double beds and a small TV mounted on the wall. It wasn't much, but it was far away from the house, and that was all Catherine cared about. They unpacked their things and settled into bed, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to them. Catherine lay on her side, staring at the wall, her body tense as she waited for the whispers to return. But the motel was silent, no voices, no strange sounds, just the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional distant car passing by outside. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to finally relax. Maybe they had escaped whatever was haunting the house. Maybe the whispers had been tied to the house all along, and now that they were away, they could start to move on. But just as she began to drift off to sleep, she heard it again. A single whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the wall behind her. "Catherine." Her eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She turned to look at Mark, but he was already sitting up, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I heard it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I heard it here." Before Catherine could respond, the whispers began to build again, louder and more insistent than ever before. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. The voices overlapped, their words jumbled and frantic, but one message was clear, repeated over and over, growing louder with each repetition. "They can't escape." Catherine's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The whispers weren't tied to the house. They had followed them, and there was no escaping them. Catherine and Mark sat frozen in the motel room, their eyes locked as the whispers surged around them like a growing storm. The room, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt stifling, the walls seeming to close in as the voices chanted in unison, their message unmistakable: they can't escape. Catherine's breath came in short, ragged bursts, her mind racing. The voices had followed them. Leaving the house hadn't stopped anything. If anything, the whispers seemed stronger, clearer now that they were here, away from the old Victorian home. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. "We need to leave now." Mark, still pale, nodded mutely. Without another word, they both scrambled out of bed, throwing on their clothes and shoving their few belongings into bags. The whispers echoed through the room, now taking on different tones, some urgent, others mocking, but all of them filled with a malevolent energy that sent chills down Catherine's spine. They know, it's too late, they can't escape. The voices twisted together, rising and falling like the ebb of a tide, a constant, relentless presence. Catherine's hand shook as she zipped her suitcase and grabbed her coat, her eyes flicking nervously around the room, half expecting the walls themselves to split open and reveal whatever was lurking behind them. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Come on," he urged, his voice tense. "We're getting out of here." They hurried down the narrow hallway of the motel, their footsteps echoing in the quiet as they reached the lobby and pushed through the door into the cold night air. For a moment, the silence of the outside world seemed almost disorienting after the oppressive whispers in the room. The parking lot was deserted, and the neon sign for the motel buzzed faintly above them. But the silence didn't last long. As they approached their car, the whispers returned, faint at first, like the rustle of wind through the trees. But Catherine knew better. These whispers weren't natural. They were insidious, clinging to the air around them like a living thing. The voices seemed to seep into her ears, wrapping around her thoughts, filling her head with dread. "Mark," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "They are still here, even outside." Mark clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the dark lot as if he could see the source of the whispers. "We'll drive until we can't hear them anymore," he said, unlocking the car with shaking hands. "We'll just keep driving." They both climbed into the car, slamming the door shut as if that could somehow block out the relentless voices. Mark turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He peeled out of the parking lot, speeding down the empty road that led away from the motel, away from the whispers that now seemed to pursue them with a single-minded intensity. For a few minutes, the car's engine drowned out the whispers, and Catherine allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could outrun whatever was haunting them. The trees lining the road blurred past them, and the night stretched out before them like a void. But as they drove deeper into the countryside, the whispers returned. At first, it was just a faint murmur, almost drowned out by the sound of the car speeding down the highway. But then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until Catherine could hear them clearly again, as if they were sitting right beside her. "They know they can't escape. It's too late for them. The end is coming." Catherine gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. She glanced at Mark, his face drawn and tense as he stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were pale. She could see the fear etched into his features, the same fear that was coursing through her own veins. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "what if we can't outrun this? What if this isn't something we can escape?" Mark didn't answer at first. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke, his voice strained. "We have to try. There has to be a way out of this. There has to be." But deep down, Catherine wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. They drove 4 hours, the road stretching out endlessly before them, and the whispers never left. They persisted. No matter how far they went, no matter how fast they drove, the voices seemed to wrap around them, clinging to the car like a thick fog, their insidious words growing clearer, more personal. "They can see you. They know your secrets. Your time is running out." Catherine shuddered, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her ears, trying in vain to block out the voices. But it was no use. They were everywhere, inside the car, inside her mind, weaving their way through her thoughts like a poison. "What do they want from us?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark didn't answer. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow as he sped down the highway. There was no traffic, no sign of other life, just a long stretch of road, illuminated by the pale glow of the headlights. Suddenly, Mark swerved the car to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. Catherine gasped, her heart leaping into her throat as she clutched the door handle. "Mark, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice edged with panic. Mark didn't respond right away. He sat there, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, his body rigid with tension. His breathing was heavy, his eyes wide and unblinking. Slowly, he turned to look at her, and for the first time, Catherine saw the full extent of the fear in his eyes. "They are not going to stop," he whispered. "No matter where we go, no matter how far we run, they are inside our heads, Catherine. They are everywhere." Catherine felt a cold dread settle over her, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. "Then what do we do?" she asked, a voice barely above a whisper. "What's left?" Mark shook his head slowly. "I don't know." They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the car idling on the side of the desolate road. The whisper surrounded them, a constant, suffocating presence. But now Catherine understood. They weren't something they could outrun or escape. The voices were right. The whispers were inside them, woven into their very existence. "We need to go back," Catherine said suddenly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Mark turned to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Go back? To the house? Why?" "Because this all started there," she said, her eyes dark with determination. "The whispers, whatever this is, it started when we moved into that house. We can't run from it. We need to confront it." Mark hesitated, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for a reason to argue. But then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "All right, let's go back." They turned the car around and drove back toward the old Victorian house that had, unknowingly, sealed their fate the moment they stepped through its doors. The whispers followed them, louder than ever, their voices rising to a fever pitch as they neared the house. When they finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before them, its tall windows dark and foreboding. Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine as they stepped out of the car and approached the front door. The whispers seemed to throb inside the house, a relentless murmur that echoed through the walls as they stepped inside. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting for their next move. Catherine looked at Mark, a pulse pounding in her ears. "This is it," she whispered. "We end this here." Together, they moved through the house, the whispers surrounding them, growing louder and more frenzied. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the voices twisted and merged into a single, deafening roar. As they reached the center of the house, the whispers stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, like the calm before a storm. And then, in the stillness, a single voice, deep, cold, and filled with malice, spoke. "You can't escape what you are." The walls shuddered, and the air seemed to grow heavier. Catherine felt a cold, creeping dread wash over her as she realized the truth. The whispers weren't predicting their deaths. They were announcing their arrival. Mark looked at her, his eyes wide with horror as the walls began to close in, and the darkness swallowed them whole. Catherine and Mark stood frozen in the center of the house, their breath caught in their throats. The oppressive silence that followed the last chilling whisper was somehow worse than the voices. The house itself felt alive, its walls vibrating with a pulse that neither of them could fully understand but instinctively feared. For a brief moment, Catherine thought they might still have a chance, that they could flee, run as far as possible from the darkness that seemed to coil around them. But as her eyes darted around the room, she realized that the walls had started to shift. What had been straight, solid surfaces were now distorted, rippling like liquid, as if the house had finally begun to show its true form. It was no longer just wood and brick, it was a living, breathing entity. "Catherine," Mark whispered hoarsely, gripping her arm as if grounding himself. His voice trembled, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she'd never seen in him before, true, primal fear. "We need to," but her words were cut off by a sudden, deep vibration that rolled through the floor beneath their feet. It was as if the very foundation of the house was awakening, and with it, the malicious force they had been running from. The whispers surged back, louder and more menacing than ever, but now they weren't just distant sounds in the walls. They were inside the house, inside their minds, speaking directly to them. "They can see you. They've always seen you." Catherine clutched the sides of her head, trying to block out the words, but they burrowed deeper, echoing through her thoughts. She staggered back, almost tripping over the uneven floor, her eyes wide with panic. "Mark, it's getting stronger," she gasped. Mark looked as though he was on the verge of collapsing, his hands trembling, his face slick with cold sweat. We have to get out of here," he said, his voice a mere rasp. But the moment he said it, the walls seemed to respond. They pulsed and bulged inward as if sealing off any escape. The front door, which had been open only moments before, was now swallowed by the undulating wooden plaster. Windows that had once provided a view of the outside world were no longer visible. The house was closing in on them. Catherine turned in circles, frantically searching for any way out. "There has to be a way. There has to." Before she could finish her sentence, a loud crack split the air, like the sound of wood snapping under immense pressure. Catherine whipped around just in time to see the floor beneath Mark give way, the wooden planks splintering and crumbling as if the house were trying to swallow him whole. Mark, she screamed, rushing toward him, but it was too late. He fell through the collapsing floor with a horrifying scream, disappearing into the dark, gaping void below. Catherine reached out desperately, but the jagged edges of the broken floor stopped her short. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the hole, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark, she screamed again, her voice breaking with fear and anguish. There was no answer, only the faint, echoing sound of his scream as it was swallowed by the darkness below. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she stared into the black abyss, her heart racing in her chest. Mark, she whispered, but she knew he was gone. The whisper surged again, more powerful now, more insistent. But they were no longer chaotic and overlapping. They had become a singular voice, deep and guttural, filled with an ancient malice that chilled Catherine to her core. "You are mine." Catherine staggered to her feet, her entire body shaking. The voice was inside her head now, crawling through her thoughts, twisting them, bending them to its will. It was no longer just a presence in the house, it was a part of her. Desperation clawed at her mind, and she turned toward the stairs. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to escape. If she could reach the attic, if she could get high enough, maybe she could find a way out. She bolted for the staircase, her feet pounding against the floor, but the house seemed to respond to her movement, the walls groaning and shifting as if it were trying to stop her. The air grew thick, suffocating, and she could feel the very atmosphere of the house closing in around her, heavy with the presence of something far older and darker than she had ever imagined. Catherine's mind was racing. She had to keep moving. She had to survive. She bounded up the stairs, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning with the effort. But with every step, the whispers grew louder, filling the space around her, blocking out every rational thought. "You belong to us. You can't escape." She reached the top of the stairs and threw herself against the door to the attic. It groaned under her weight, but after a few desperate pushes, it gave way. Catherine stumbled into the attic, slamming the door shut behind her. The room was cold, darker than the rest of the house, with only a sliver of moonlight filtering in through the small window. For a moment, there was silence. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart. She collapsed onto the floor, her back pressed against the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her face, and her mind reeled from everything that had happened. Mark was gone. The house was alive, and it had claimed him. And now, it wanted her. In the dim light of the attic, she saw movement in the shadows. Slowly, she lifted her head, her breath catching in her throat. In the far corner of the room, something stirred, a figure, barely visible in the gloom. At first, she thought it was another trick of the house, another hallucination brought on by the whispers. But as the figure stepped forward into the pale moonlight, Catherine felt her blood run cold. It was Mark, or at least, it looked like him. But there was something wrong. His face was twisted, his eyes hollow and empty, his skin pale and translucent, like he was no longer fully there. He stood in the center of the room, staring at her with an expression that was both familiar and utterly alien. "Mark," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. She scrambled to her feet, taking a hesitant step toward him. But he didn't respond. He just stared at her, his eyes vacant, unblinking. And then, slowly, his mouth opened. "They took me," he whispered, his voice distant, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. "I'm part of the house now." Catherine's stomach twisted in horror. No, this isn't real," she whispered, backing away. "You're not him. You can't be." But Mark's figure, whatever it was, took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You can't escape, Catherine," he said softly, his voice echoing with the whispers that had haunted them both. "You never could." She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The figure of Mark smiled, a cold, empty smile that chilled her to the bone. "It's real," he said, his voice now lead with the voices of the house. "And now, you'll join me." The walls of the attic began to ripple, the shadows lengthening and twisting around her. The room grew darker, colder, and Catherine felt a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. As the figure of Mark stepped closer, his face twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Catherine let out a choked sob. She tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house had consumed her, just as it had consumed Mark. And in that final moment, as the darkness closed in and the whispers filled her mind, Catherine understood the truth. The house had never been just a house. It was something ancient, something malevolent, and it had been waiting for them, waiting to claim them. Now it had won, and there was no escape.